It's my pleasure to be joined once again by Byron King from Blood Horse to break down the Preakness after he was kind enough to join me to preview the Kentucky Derby. And now we've got a Derby winner. Byron, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Now, I think you called it. You told us to watch out for Mage, and that field's significantly larger than the one we're going to see in the Preakness Stakes. But can you start by updating us on how Mage has been training and looking coming into the Preakness?
Sure. Well, he's been doing rather well. His connections appropriately wanted to take some time to evaluate his health, make sure he came out of the Derby in good condition before they committed him for the Preakness Stakes. There's just a 2-week turnaround from the Derby to the Preakness. And in fact, he's the only horse that raced in the Kentucky Derby that is running in the Preakness. All the other ones are new shooters. So it was set up long ago, the Triple Crown, to where there were 2 weeks between the Derby and the Preakness, and then 3 to the Belmont. But today's horses are typically spaced out; their races are, and as a result, there's no other horses that are coming out of the Derby to face Mage.
How big of a concern should that be for Mage's connections that's the only horse that's on that turnaround?
Well, on one end, it's a positive for them, right? I mean, the Derby draws the cream of the crop, so therefore, if no other horses are running back, he's facing a little bit easier competition. There's no doubt about it. This race, that if he runs back to his Kentucky Derby, he wins. The question is can he, like any other great athlete, reproduce a top performance on such a short turnaround? I mean, we see it in other kinds of sports with human athletes, and of course, horses are in some ways similar and in other ways different in terms of there is a tendency sometimes to get knocked out after a hard effort. So that will be the big key: is does he take a step back? Does he run just a little bit slower than he did in the Kentucky Derby? If so, it opens up the possibilities.
And it seems like, and I know you can detail this better than me, that the trainer that his connections have, this Venezuelan trainer who they call the Puma, Gustavo Delato, has a very unique style in terms of the way that Mage has been working, the amount of work in these training sessions. Can you explain that to us, and why that's something that might work to their advantage or even disadvantage?
Sure. So most horses, when they're prepared for a upcoming race, their trainers will usually put them through workouts that are about a half mile in length or 5/8 of a mile in length. A little bit, think roughly half of the distance of which they'll run a race like the Kentucky Derby. But the trainer Gustavo Delgado Sr., who trains Mage, has elected to give his horses a little bit longer workouts, but not at such a high rate of speed. So a little bit longer, a little bit slower. That's how he prepared him. And he bases this off of his training history in Venezuela. He was a Triple Crown winning trainer down there. Now, it doesn't really necessarily apply to the Preakness because, as I alluded to earlier, the short turnaround, most of the trainers will not give their horse a high-speed workout, otherwise called a breeze, in between the 2 weeks to come back in. Now, horses will certainly exercise, but they tend to gallop or jog, which is more, just as the name would suggest, a lighter form of exercise and less high speed.
Is it akin to he essentially is training these horses like endurance athletes rather than sprinters? I mean, is that kind of the thinking? Is longer, slower workouts over time build more endurance that show up in these big races?
That is, I believe, his thinking around it is he wants to have this horse have plenty of stamina, and he showed that in the Kentucky Derby, which is a 1.25 mile race, which was farther than any of those horses had run. The Preakness is another long race. It's not quite as long as the Kentucky Derby. It's 1 3/16, so a 16th of a mile shorter. But it does show a little bit. On some ends, though, horse certainly has, you can train them to be a little more successful in something, but they also have to have the innate ability and the stamina and the bloodlines that help to a horse to negotiate a race of that length. A lot of horses that might be sprinters might only run 3/4 of a mile, just to kind of put it in perspective, the differences between a sprinter and a horse that we call running in a classic race like the Derby or the Preakness.
Does this mean that Mage could potentially be set up to do really well at the Belmont Stakes, a race of that distance, if if they can manage to get a win here in the Preakness against a shorter field, but a field that has new shooters?
I think the Belmont will be a very hard test for him, not only in terms of stamina, but also because he'll be taking on some fresher horses that sat this leg out. So, for example, Angel of Empire, who was third in the Kentucky Derby, he was the Kentucky Derby favorite. He is supposed to run back in the Belmont Stakes. Additionally, there was another one of the favorites in that race, Tappet Trice, who I
Mhm.
think he ended up seventh, but he has like the perfect kind of pedigree and bloodlines for success in a race like the Belmont Stakes. And then even Forte, who was the scratched Kentucky Derby favorite, could reappear there. So I think it's a combination of, he's going to face some tougher competition than he would in the Preakness. He's going to not have as much rest as they'll have. And then when you look at Mage's pedigree, it's certainly, while it's not geared entirely towards speed, it doesn't have quite as many stamina influences compared to, say, a horse such as Tappet Trice. Tappet Trice is by a stallion named Tappet, whose progeny have excelled in that race. So Mage is by a stallion named Good Magic, who was second in the Kentucky Derby, but a mile and a quarter was kind of the limit of what his sire Good Magic wanted to run.
It's so interesting to think about these horses' bloodlines and what their sires accomplished and how that translates to future generations of these horses. It's so interesting to hear you break it down. And if it was as easy as that, a lot of people I think would be making a lot more money because it's such a fun roll of the dice when the race comes around. But it's so fun to hear about a horse's bloodlines and what they're sort of destined to do. When you look at the new shooters that are in the Preakness field, I know, I think I heard you say a couple minutes ago that if Mage truly doesn't need the more rest, that he's good on this turnaround, that he's the horse to beat. Which new shooters do you like that you think could really threaten in this race?
Well, I think the single biggest threat to him is a horse by the name of First Mission. First Mission has only raced 3 times, so very inexperienced, but so was Mage in the Kentucky Derby. He only had 3 races heading into that start. He won a maiden race, a race for horses that had not won before in his second career start, and then he won a stakes race at Keeneland. He's a very talented, gifted horse that has a ton of blue sky. Just kind of his situation is he might translate to the equivalent of a new college graduate heading into the NBA for the first time. We think he's going to be able to perform at that level, but we don't quite know just yet. But First Mission is a very talented horse. Another one that is a leading threat is Blazing Sevens. Blazing Sevens was a horse that won a Grade 1 race, a top level race last year as a 2-year-old. He has not won in 2 starts at 3, but he showed improvement in his last start when he was third, and he seems like he's making some incremental progress. And his trainer, Chad Brown, has won the Preakness 2 times. And then the last horse that I would throw out there as a possibility as well is National Treasure, who's trained by Bob Baffert. This horse is likely to show speed from his inside post position. And usually, speed horses are at an advantage in a race because they're in front. They're not having somebody kicking dirt back at them, those kinds of things. And so, speed horses are always dangerous. That is National Treasure, who breaks from the rail.
I know Baffert was serving the last year, I believe, of his suspension at Churchill Downs, so wasn't at the Derby. Do you expect him to be at the Preakness? Is he allowed to be at the Preakness? And if so, how has the horse racing community sort of processed everything that has happened to Bob, and has the horse racing community sort of moved on from the scandal involving who many consider to be one of, if not the greatest trainer of all time?
Right. So just to recap the Bob Baffert situation, he was issued a suspension that was from the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission that he served, and that is honored by other regulators across the country. So he had to serve those days, and he did last year for that amount of time, but it was relatively short. Churchill Downs acted differently, and they decided to bar him for over 2 years, which continues through early July of this year, so he can be back at next year's Kentucky Derby. They essentially just acted as a private property owner. They said, you gave a black eye to the Kentucky Derby by having your horse test positive in the race, and so therefore, as a private property owner, you're going to have to sit out a couple Kentucky Derbies. Very similar to maybe a restaurant owner that decides to say, hey, you were a bad actor in my restaurant the other day, and I don't want you back. So that kind of thing. Now, other tracks don't have to necessarily honor it, just like another restaurant say wouldn't. So Pimlico Racecourse does not have to follow Churchill Downs' lead, and so as a result, National Treasure is competing there, and more than likely, I would suspect that Bob Baffert will be there. He sent his assistant, Jimmy Barnes, with the horse, but that's pretty par for the course for Baffert because most of his stable is out in California, and so naturally it makes sense to overlook those horses or to look after those horses and then travel around race day, that kind of thing. And then there's also a big sale shortly after the Preakness, so he'll be looking for his next prospects for next year.
And has everybody moved on from the magnitude of that moment? I mean, even for those who don't follow horse racing closely, because it was Churchill Downs, because it was the Kentucky Derby, I mean, it became a national headline. Where does everybody sort of fall on Bob coming back into the fold from a vantage point of just being visible? Because obviously he's had horses and passed them to different trainers, and he has Jimmy. But now that he's back, how does everybody feel about it?
Well, I think you could take a poll of 10 people, and you might get maybe not 10 different answers, but you'd get a wide variety. I think there's some people that feel as if these medications were small potatoes, trivial kind of things that he ran in trouble with. There are others that say, what, whether it was intended or not intended, he gave a black eye to the game, and the way that he handled it afterward doesn't sit well with people in terms of the various lawsuits. So, I mean, you can have a wide variety of opinions on it. I think there's no doubt, though, that the horses that he trains are of very high quality. And so when you have horses trained by Bob Baffert in your race, your race is going to be a little bit better than it would be minus his horses because they are so good. In fact, he runs a horse, besides National Treasure, he runs a horse named Feza in the Black-Eyed Susan Stakes, which is kind of the warm-up race to the Preakness Stakes the day before. And she's one of the top 3-year-old fillies in the country. So there's no doubt that he trains a star stable of horses, and their presence in a race adds quality. But a wide variety of opinions about Bob Baffert.
Is Feza the odds-on favorite or the favorite in the Black-Eyed Susan? Is that a quality field?
She is the favorite in that particular race. It is a good field, much like the Kentucky Oaks, which is the race that is run for 3-year-old fillies preceding the Kentucky Derby the day before. The Black-Eyed Susan kind of fills a similar role. But at the same time, because it is also 2 weeks rest, you have horses that are not returning back from the Kentucky Oaks. You have usually horses that are choosing this as an easier spot. Now, in Bob Baffert's case, he probably would have run Feza in the Kentucky Oaks were it not for his band. So this is a horse that may have been the favorite, if not, well, certainly would have been one of the favorites had she run in the Kentucky Oaks.
Interesting. One quick point, and then just a couple more questions on Mage and sort of the strategy heading into the Preakness. For a lot of people that don't follow the sport, I know some people were alarmed or troubled when news broke before the Kentucky Derby of the horse deaths that occurred at Churchill. How do you sort of make that digestible for people that aren't familiar with the sport, and what is the latest on that sort of developing story in terms of where that story is going now?
Well, they're looking into those deaths, and they don't have a specific thing that they can just pinpoint and say it was this one thing that we can just fix with it. There are elements of this sport that have long, over many, many years, we've had injuries, and unfortunately, horses, unlike people, if we break a leg, it's a fairly simple thing for us to recover, right? We get a cast on, we prop our leg up for a couple months, we walk around on crutches. But a racehorse is different, and any horse really is different in the sense that they can develop these secondary problems. So you may remember Barbaro, who was pulled up in the Preakness Stakes years ago. They tried to save his life after he took a bad step and injured himself, and he developed these other complications, and unfortunately he ended up perishing. So there are things that we just can't do for a horse that we can do for people. And so sometimes those horses are euthanized when it looks as if they would be in for a long and potentially painful struggle. But as to what causes that, there are many factors involved in it. So one of those factors, at least that I believe, is that the breed's a little more fragile than it once was. Horses used to be able to run back more quickly between races, that kind of thing. But now they tend to need more rest. They tend to need more recovery, and potentially they're a little more fragile than they once were. I think people's views about animals and things of that nature has also changed. They have, due to put some of the safety in perspective. All these horses, when they go out, they have to have veterinary inspections before they compete. And initially, some of the things like the drug protocols that flagged a horse like Medina Spirit prevent a horse from being able to have any type of, or a certain threshold of anti-inflammatory or painkiller in their system. They don't want them going out there to where they might potentially be compromised. So they go through a pretty extensive evaluation. And in fact, some of the horses that were scratched from the Kentucky Derby, including Forte, was scratched by the regulatory veterinarian. His people wanted to run him. He had been dealing with a bruised foot, which is not, in the scheme of things, a major problem. But at the same time, if you're favoring a part of your body, you might be more likely to injure another part, right? So he didn't allow him to compete. So there are a lot of protocols that go into it. And I think the industry is working very hard to try to prevent some of these accidents, because they're tragic and they're horrible. But I wish there were just one or two easy things that we could just say and fix it. But it's just really, no one's been able to pinpoint specifically those one or two things.
What's the most significant thing that's being done now to try to prevent a similar thing from happening?
So changes in medication, for one. Okay, so in the old days, horses could run with, let's say, they call them non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medicines. That's the same thing of if you pulled ibuprofen out of your cabinet, that it would be classified as that. So those kinds of things that they don't want anything to potentially mask their any kind of discomfort that they might have, so that the veterinarians, when they check them, can say, you know what, let's have this horse sit this one out, right? So that's number one. Changes too in their preparations. So they have to submit to veterinary exams ahead of time. It makes it a little more costly for the owner to participate in a race. But, these men and women that are these veterinarians, they can spot things that the common person just cannot, just slight changes in their gait that many times can point to something nagging at the horse a little bit. So those are just two of the things. And then they also put the racetrack through all kinds of evaluations. So there is one man named Mick Peterson who evaluates the dirt. I mean, when we look out at a racetrack, we just see dirt, right? But, he'll break it down and its components and its depth and the materials that are in it, and work to try to monitor it and track it in a database so that they can try to be as consistent and as safe as possible. So those are just three of the things. And then the last thing that I would say too is there's a new oversight coming to, it's already begun to an extent, but it's called the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority. And they're regulating the sport on a federal basis. Things used to be done state by state. And so the idea is to add this uniformity and strict rules to try to limit that as well.
It's a comprehensive breakdown there, and I appreciate it. So just lastly for you, Byron, before I let you go, Mage, I think, has post position 3 in the Preakness. Can you sort of break down what you think is going to happen during the race, and does the strategy at all change with a field of only 8?
Well, a little bit. I think what you're going to see is the rail-drawn horse, National Treasure, likely show speed. Of course, so much is dependent on how the horses break from the starting gate. But let's just say that they all break smoothly and cleanly. I think you'll see him bust out of there and try to take charge of the race early and put himself in a position to say, come and catch me. I think a horse, a long shot named Coffee with Chris, will be probably chasing him on the outside. Mage is going to be in the mid to rear part of the pack, I would say. And First Mission, one of the other horses I mentioned earlier, I think he'll be more stalking, just, sitting third, fourth, that kind of thing. Mage tends not to break well, and he did not in the Kentucky Derby. So I think if he does not break sharply, I think they'll be patient with him. I think if I were riding Mage, I would say, okay, I'm going to try to replicate what I did in the Kentucky Derby as best I can. And in other words, if my horse breaks slowly, I'm going to let him relax, and I'm going to come with that powerful move on the second turn and try to run him down in the stretch. So that's what I would anticipate in the Preakness Stakes.
And do you think Mage will get it done?
I do. I think he will get it done. I don't think this field is particularly strong by Preakness standards. And I think that, I think sometimes we can overanalyze the 2-week turnaround and think, well, because so many other horses didn't do it, that it's more of an obstacle than it is. So I do believe Mage will be successful on Saturday.
Byron King, thank you so much from Blood Horse for the time. Appreciate it. Enjoy the weekend. And I'm going to watch this interview back once it's done and take some notes here and place my bets. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, Carolyn.